So before we start with this, I want to just explain a little bit about a JWT token. JWT token is made up of three parts. There's a part that tells you what the encoding algorithm is. There's a part with your payload. And the third part is basically an encrypted version of your payload that's encrypted with a specific key. So if you look at a JWT token, this part is just a base 64 encoded version of this data. So there's nothing in here that you want to put in that's incredibly secret. Here's just the user's ID that you're putting here. If someone actually was able to get a hold of this token, they could probably do some damage with this token by impersonating a user. But this is why most of these things are done over SSL, and you could put expiration dates on these tokens and that sort of thing. But the key here is that once I end up encoding this, so this has been encoded with, I've basically taken this token, I generated it, I've used the key foo. If I attempt to encode this with any other data, it'll go and say, hey, look, I'm taking this encoded data that you have here, I'm encrypting it with this key of FO, it doesn't work. So if I go over here and I change this, this is going to be authenticated. So if you have a token, although you could mess around with that token, if you do, what'll end up happening is that there'll be a comparison between the encrypted version of the data, and unless you know what the key is on the data, you really can't generate a token on your own. It's really the key that you want to end up keeping secret. So what I want to do here is I want to create a basic API that's going to do two things. So I'm going to make a directory here. I'm going to call this Acme API, and I'm going to go into it. I'm going to do a npm init. There's a couple of modules that I want to need, and I want to do this within the context of testing. Have a couple of tests that are in there that we can end up running. Not a bad idea to see this, get a little bit of exposure to this. So this is going to, I'm going to end up installing Express, body parser. These are two things that I need. The other thing that I need to do is I need to have a module that'll do my JWT encoding and decoding for me. So I'm going to bring in a module called JWT simple, and I'm going to save it. I'm going to also do an npm install of what I need for testing. So I'm going to do an npm install, and I'm going to use Mocha. I'm going to use Chai, and I'm going to use super test, and here I'm just going to say save dev, because I only need this for my development environment. I'm going to touch a directory called test. And let me go in now and open up Vim and actually start setting up some tests. So there's basically two routes that I'm concerned with here. Again, you could have other routes, but the two routes that I'm focused on are going to be the routes that end up creating the token based upon a username and password, and also a route that when passed a token will end up returning to me some data that I only should be able to get with a valid token. So let me go over here, and I'm going to just keep this simple. I'm going to call this API spec.js. And what are my tests going to end up looking like? So I'm going to have describe, and I'm going to describe my API. Within my API, I'm going to describe post, and this is going to be for generating a token. So in RESTful style, I'm going to say I want to be able to post to API tokens. Within that, I'm going to have two scenarios, describe with valid credentials, and also with invalid credentials. Thank you. And what do I expect? Well, with valid credentials, it returns a valid token. And with invalid credentials, it's going to return a 401. And let's just go over here and let's just look at our package JSON file. And in my tests, since I installed Mocha, I'm going to say /node modules Mocha bin Mocha, and I'm just going to simply run it with the flag watch so that it ends up watching my files. And just for starters, I'm going to go over here and I'll say npm test. Tells me 2 tests that are passing, but that's just because I have no real expectations. Let's go back in here and also describe second part of this. And this is going to be a get, where I'm going to pass this token back in. And this is going to be, I'm just going to call this API me. This is going to return the user based upon a token. So I'm going to describe, not with valid credentials, with a valid token returns the correct user. With an invalid token, it's going to return a 401. And let's just go over here. So I've got these 4 tests. Everything you could do here is we could go through these one at a time. I'll put an X in front of here, X, and X. So what do I expect with my application? Well, let's go over here, and in the fashion of having an application, I'll say that I'm going to have this app. This is going to require super test, and I'm going to end up requiring /. I'm going to go up 1 level, and I'm going to grab my Express application. Again, this doesn't exist yet. I'm going to have to end up creating this. At this point, probably going to get an error because it can't find app. So let's go over here. And this is going to be app.js. And we'll start setting this up. This is going to be Express, require Express. This is going to be app equals Express. Let's also do app.use, and let's require body parser. We're going to use JSON as our body parser. And I'll say module.exports equals my app. So this should be my Express application. I'm going to be moving back and forth between these 2 files. And let's just rerun that. And I'm back in business here. Now, what do I want to test here? I also want to bring in my require JWT simple, which is going to be do my encoding and decoding. The only thing that it needs is to have a payload and a secret, and we'll end up getting to that in a second. So let's do the returns a valid token. So here I'm going to do a return, and I'm going to say app.post. I'm going to post to /API.tokens. I want to generate a token. And I'm going to end up sending, and let's go over here and I'll say const credentials. And this is going to be username and a password. Username is going to be Mo. Password is going to be lowercase mo. And I'm going to send my credentials. And I'm assuming that these are going to be the correct credentials. So I'm going to expect a 200. If I end up going back here, I'll find that I'm getting not a 200, I'm getting a 404. Well, let's take a look and see what we could do here. Let's do an app.post to /API.tokens. Again, eventually you'd end up breaking this thing out. Request, response, next. If I wanted to get this to pass, I could say response.send an empty object, and I'd pass. That's not really what I want to do. What I want to do here is I'm going to take my credentials, and I'm going to get them from my request.body. I'm using my JSON parser, and I'm going to use some ES6 to grab my username and my password. And I'm going to specify user, and I'm going to have some users array. Again, if you were using SQLize, you would end up having to do this by using a promise. But here, I'm going to have some users array where I'm going to find the user, where the user.username is equal to the username, and the user.password is equal to the password. What do my users look like? Well, for now, we're just going to say users is equal to an array. We'll have two users. We'll have an ID of 1. We'll have a username of Mo. We'll have a password of Mo. And let's just say that we'll just send some other data just so we can test it out. We'll say if Mo's favorite is Foo. So we've got Mo. Let's now go over here. This is going to be 2. Larry. Larry. And Larry's going to like bar. And we'll go over here and we'll say, hey, look, if in fact we were able to find the user, what we want to do is we want to create a token. So what we're going to do to create a token is we'll say return response.send, and we're going to need our JWT, require JWT simple. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say my secret is going to be process environment secret. But if I'm in a development environment, I'm just going to say, hey, look, this is just going to be foobar. And so what I need to do is that I need to, if I have a user, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, look, JWT, I want you to encode. The payload that I want you to encode is going to be an ID, which is the user's ID. It also needs to have a secret, and this is going to be the secret. And it's going to end up sending this back, but in order to send it back in RESTful fashion here, I'm going to put this inside of this token. So here's my JWT encoded token, and that's what will end up coming back from the user if, in fact, I could find the user. Let's just see if this passes, which it does. Let's actually test it out a little bit in more detail by going in here and saying, hey, look, my token is going to be JWT encode. Again, I know what my user IDs is already. My user ID is going to be 1, and I'm going to end up encoding it with foobar. And so I could write a little bit more about this expectation and do a then. This ends up giving me a result. And I could say I expect the result. This is going to come back as JSON data. Result.body.token to equal this token that I have on the top. If this data is correct, I know that Mo has an ID of 1. What I expect to get back is a token that's been encoded with the secret foobar. So let's actually go over here. We need to bring in our expect. So we're going to get our expect equals require, and we're going to get that from Chai. So let's take a look. We'll see that that seems to be passing as well. Let's just make a break by going in and making this ubar. And now you can see our tokens. Those tokens are not equal, okay? But again, if we know what the secret is, we can go and we can end up regenerating the token. This is the token that I expect if I'm using the secret foobar, and we end up passing. Now, let's actually take this code This is going to be a little bit simpler with invalid credentials. And we'll go over here and we'll say with invalid credentials, let's change this password to O. We don't expect to get any token back. In fact, if we do this, this is going to break, or it should break. Well, let's first get rid of this X over here. And what's happening is that this is timing out because we're not dealing with a situation where, in fact, they don't have a user. Otherwise, or actually, we know if we make it down here, we'll say response.sendStatus, and we're going to end up sending back a 401, unauthorized. And so we've got a 401, which is really what we should have been expecting here. So now we've got a way of generating a token with valid credentials and with invalid credentials. So now let's figure out what we're going to do here. Now, usually what you end up doing with tokens in an application, you could send them as strings and you could make it part of the express route, but a little nicer way to do it is to send it up as a header. So one of the things that you can do is that when you end up generating an Axios request, you could end up setting headers with those Axios requests. And I could do it with supertest as well. The syntax is a little bit different. So what's my expectation? So with a valid token. So let's generate a valid token. Let's go up here. This looks like a valid token. And we'll say that with a valid token, what we're going to do is we're going to do a return, and we'll say app.get/API me. And what we can do with supertest is to basically set headers. And I'm going to set a header, which I'm going to call auth header, because that's really what this is, an authorization header. And I'm going to end up sending this token. What do I expect if I end up sending this token? Well, I'm going to end up expecting to get a 200 back, and I'm also going to expect to get the correct user. So for starters, if we just do this, we'll say that that's not found. Let's go and set up our second route. So here we're going to do an app.get. This is /API. This is me. Request, response, next. And what I'm going to end up doing here is something similar here, but what I want to do here is I'm going to be getting a token. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say token equals request.headers, and I can access any header. A header has basically a key and a value. That's all they are. Headers are just key value pairs, and I'm going to grab the auth header. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to specify const ID equals JWT. Instead of encoding, I'm going to decode. And I'm going to decode this token with my secret. And I'm going to be very optimistic here and assume that this is going to give me my payload, which is going to be an ID. And I'll go over here and I'll use something similar here, which is going to be const user equals users.find user user.id equals this ID that was passed in here. And I'm going to be very optimistic here, and I'll say response.send, and I'll send back this user object. So if I do that with a valid token, it'll actually give me the correct user. I could test this a little bit more by going in here and putting in a then, which is going to be a result. And what do I expect? I expect that I'm getting Mo back here. So I could just write a expectation, expect result.body, which should be Mo, and Mo's favorite to equal foo. And that's going to pass as well. Let's just make it break. It's always nice to go from red to green. So we've taken care of the happy case, but what about the invalid case? We'll go over here. We'll pretend that someone tried to monkey around with our token. They don't know our secret, and they've guessed at some user ID. And we'll go back over here. And with an invalid token, so an invalid token is going to be generated with a key. That's an invalid key. We don't expect to get a 200. We expect to get a 401. Okay? Instead, we have a 500 error. And the fact is, what ends up happening with JWT is that if JWT attempts to decode a token that is a token that's not a correct token, meaning it looks at that token and it looks at the payload and it looks at the encrypted version of the payload, and it realizes that it's been monkeyed around with, that it doesn't match up, it throws an error. So all we have to do here is take this and put it in a try and put it in a catch. And if I make it down to this catch, I'll say response, send status, 401. Okay? Now I've got all my tests passing. What I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to set up a server to run this, and I'm going to create a little React application inside of another folder. And I'm going to hit this API like you would end up doing with a normal API. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to add a server.js file, and I'm going to simply do a require /app listen, and just so I can deploy it later on, I'll say process.environment port, or just for the sake of argument, I'll put this at a port of 3003. I'm going to go over here to my package JSON file, and if I go over here, I'm going to kill this test, and if I go over here and I say npm start, it should end up running my server. I should be able to see that by going over here and localhost 3003 API me should give me unauthorized because I haven't passed in any token. Okay? Well, I've got my React generator application here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all this code and I'm going to paste it. This is a React application that has Redux in it, all set up. And in fact, I'm going to go up one level here, and I'm going to add a folder, and this is going to be API web. And I'll go over here, and I'm going to add this, and this is going to be index.html. And I'm going to literally go in and paste this entire application in here. And I'll go over here and I will open up my application, cd /, and this is going to be Acme Web. Cd, let me rename that. That's not a good name. So let's go over here, cd Acme Web, which is going to, I want it to utilize my API. I'm just going to open this up as a regular HTML page, double click on it. Here's my React application. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to open this up. Now, I've got this hard coded right now so that when I click on this, it'll actually tell me that I'm logged in as Mo. And the reason why it's doing it is that if I go over here, so here's my Acme Web, edit anyway. If I scroll down here, I've got some code commented out here. So I actually, by luck, has it. I've got this code commented out, where what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to make a call, instead of actually sending the credentials. So right now, I'm hard coding this. And if I look at my attempt login, when I end up clicking on this button, you can see I'm actually sending a user in here directly, and that's what's logging the user. That's not what I want to do. I want to use the credentials and call a third-party API. So let's go down here to my attempt login thunk, and I'm going to uncomment this, and I'm going to uncomment this, and I'll get rid of that. So this is actually already set up to use my 3003 with my credentials. This is with Axios, how you end up setting a header. It's a second parameter, and you give it an object for your headers. So this is my auth header that I'm calling with Axios. And if I was very lucky, which I'm not going to be, if I click on login, this would work, but I get an error. And the problem is that when you attempt to make an XHR call to a cross domain, what ends up happening is before it ends up doing this, it actually calls the cross domain to determine whether or not it's going to accept cross-origin calls. And what happens is that it attempts to make this call with a header to find out if I'm allowed to make cross-origin calls, and it finds out it hasn't been set up, my API hasn't been set up to allow cross-origin requests. Well, very simple change that I need to make here. I'm going to go back here, I'm going to kill this, and I'm going to do an npm install of something called cores, and I'm going to save it. I'm going to go back up here to my Acme API, and in my app, the same way that I use middleware for my body parser, I'm going to say if someone comes to you and asks you whether or not you accept cross-origin requests, I'm going to use this cores module, which allows you to configure. Maybe you only want to allow requests from certain locations, okay, or certain types of requests. But I'm just going to keep this pretty open and say, hey, look, I allow pretty much any type of cross-origin call to my API. In which case, if I go back here and I say npm start, this will end up running. And if I go back here without even making any changes, now I'm going to end up getting my results. If I go over here, one thing that's a little bit different, if I reload this page, I'll be logged out again. But notice when I click login, notice there's two requests to tokens. Since it's a cross-origin request, the first one comes in, and there's a special request method called options. And in the response header, it comes back and it says, yep, we'll accept it from anywhere. We accept gets, puts, patches, posts, and deletes. It allows me to do my post with this data that I have here. I could probably take out that ID of 1, and I end up getting back my token. I then end up doing another options for API me. I end up calling API me. Here's my request header with my authorization token. And I end up getting back this user with their favorite. Okay? So those are the two parts of the puzzle. Setting up an API. If you're going to utilize that API and you're going to call it from another domain, which is something that is pretty common to do, you're just going to have to make sure that your API ends up accepting cross-origin requests. And that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to do in the time frame that I wanted to do it. Let me stop this.